The morning was covered in a soft mist, the kind of weather that seemed to perfectly reflect Richard's state of mind. He stood in front of the large gates of his late father's mansion, a place that had always felt more like a mausoleum of ambitions and wealth than a home. The reading of the will was about to take place, and although he knew his life wouldn't change much after that day, he couldn't help but feel a slight tremor of anxiety. Beside him, his older brother Henry exuded an almost unsettling confidence. He was certain he would inherit most of their father's real estate empire, and his triumphant smile left no doubt about it. Richard, on the other hand, had always felt out of place in this world of luxury and power. Since childhood, he had preferred the company of animals over humans, a tendency that led him to become a veterinarian instead of following in his father's footsteps. This choice had always been a source of jokes at family gatherings, especially from Henry, who saw Richard's work as trivial and unimportant. But Richard never cared. He found fulfillment in his simplicity, in his small veterinary clinic on the outskirts of town, where he could make a difference in the lives of animals and by extension, their owners. When all the family members had finally gathered in the library, the lawyer began reading the will. As expected, most of the fortune, including the businesses and properties, was left to Henry. Richard listened without surprise, but what came next caught everyone off guard. Richard would inherit only one thing, an old lame ox named Big Guy, which had been their father's favorite. Henry let out a loud, sarcastic laugh, the sound echoing off the book-lined walls. "You were always Dad's favorite, huh, Richard? An old ox for a simple man like you seems fair." Henry's words were laced with mockery, but Richard remained unfazed. He hadn't expected anything different. His father, in some way, knew he would value something so simple and meaningful. While the other family members murmured amongst themselves, Richard just nodded, accepting his inheritance with a slight smile. He looked out the library window, his gaze lost in the distant fields. He knew Big Guy was more than just an ox. It was a reminder of the time he had spent with his father, of the silent lessons he had learned while watching the old man care for the animals. He remembered the afternoons spent on the farm, where his father taught him the importance of patience and dedication. Big Guy was the last link to those memories, and Richard decided at that moment that he would honor the inheritance in a way that Henry would never understand. After leaving the mansion, Richard headed straight to his small farm. On the way, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also a growing determination. Big Guy was waiting for him, and he would do everything he could to take care of the old ox. Deep down, Richard knew he had received something money couldn't buy, a chance to reconnect with the roots of his family, with the things that really mattered. When he arrived at the farm, Richard found Big Guy in the pasture, the ox lying down, clearly bothered by his injured leg. Richard knelt beside the animal and ran his hand over its rough coat. "Come on, Big Guy," he murmured. "Let's show them what really matters." And so Richard's real challenge began. It wasn't just about caring for a sick animal, but about proving to himself, and perhaps to Henry, that true wealth wasn't in how many zeros were in a bank account, but in the love and dedication you put into the simple things in life. Richard dedicated himself to caring for Big Guy like never before. The routine on the farm became centered around the ox's recovery, and each small progress was celebrated with silent satisfaction. Big Guy's injured leg, the result of years of neglect and hard work, required more than just veterinary treatment. It required patience and affection, two things Richard had in abundance. The first few weeks were challenging. Big Guy was weak, and it seemed like there was little that could be done to improve his condition. The walks in the pasture were short, and each step the ox took was followed by Richard's attentive gaze, analyzing every movement with the hope of seeing some improvement. The days passed slowly, with the shadow of failure looming over Richard. He knew Henry wouldn't miss the chance to mock his efforts if Big Guy didn't recover, but Richard didn't give up. He started using techniques he had learned over the years, supplementing the treatment with natural herbs and physical therapy, as well as providing Big Guy with a special diet. Over time, Richard noticed that Big Guy was beginning to respond to the care. The ox began to get up more easily and walk with more confidence, albeit still hesitantly. Each day brought a small victory, and Richard began to believe that it was possible not only to restore Big Guy's health, but also to transform him into something more. While Richard was busy with Big Guy, Henry continued to expand his businesses, paying little attention to what his brother was doing. He was caught up in high-level negotiations and social events, his life a whirlwind of meetings and parties. However, a sense of emptiness began to creep into his hectic routine. The friends who had always been around started to seem less reliable, and the superficial conversations became unbearable. Henry couldn't understand why, with so much success, he felt so unsatisfied. One night, after a long day at work, Henry found himself alone in his mansion, surrounded by luxury but with no one to share it with. He remembered his father's words, spoken during one of the rare moments of intimacy between them. "Money can buy you many things, Henry, but never true companionship. For that, you need to be someone of value." Henry had never taken those words seriously, always believing that a person's value was directly related to the size of their fortune. While Henry was lost in thought, Richard was at the farm, watching Big Guy sleep. He felt connected to the ox in a deep way, as if he were sharing not only his time but also his emotions with the animal. Richard's dedication was finally bearing fruit, and Big Guy, although still lame, was stronger and healthier than ever. The ox had regained some of his strength, and his spirit seemed more alive, as if he were responding to the affection and dedication Richard had shown him. Word about Big Guy's recovery began to spread through the small rural community. Local farmers visited the farm, curious to see the ox that was defying expectations. Richard, always humble, shared the techniques he was using, but made sure to emphasize that the real key to Big Guy's recovery was the love and attention given to the animal. This caused amazement in many, who had always believed that success was tied to material factors, not feelings. At the same time, Richard began to notice something more about Big Guy. The ox had an imposing stature, with muscles that, even in his advanced age, revealed exceptional genetics. Richard realized that if he could complete Big Guy's recovery, the ox could become not only a symbol of resilience, but also a valuable animal, capable of attracting the attention of cattle breeders across the country. With this in mind, Richard doubled his efforts. He knew time was crucial, as Big Guy didn't have many years left, and his health was still fragile. However, Richard believed that if he stayed the course, he could turn Big Guy into something that no one, not even Henry, could have ever imagined. And as he worked, a seed of hope began to sprout in his heart. The hope that through Big Guy, he could finally show the world and Henry that true wealth wasn't measured in money but in dedication and love. The following months brought a remarkable change for both Richard and Big Guy. The ox, who once seemed doomed to a life of pain and suffering, now walked firmly through the pasture, his once injured leg nearly fully healed. Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of pride every time he saw Big Guy walking confidently, his head held high as if aware of his own transformation. With Big Guy's recovery nearly complete, Richard began to plan for the future. He knew the annual rural fair was approaching, and this event represented a unique opportunity. The fair attracted cattle breeders from all over the country, many of them looking for exceptional animals to improve their herds. Richard was convinced that Big Guy could be that animal, not only because of his impressive recovery, but also because of his genetic value, which had been overlooked for so long. Meanwhile, Henry remained immersed in his business, but the emptiness in his personal life only deepened. He found himself increasingly isolated, even amid the luxury and crowds that once surrounded him. The laughter that used to fill his lavish dinner parties now seemed forced, and the looks from the people around him carried an interest that he knew was more for his money than for his company. The allure of material success was beginning to lose its charm, and for the first time in his life, Henry began to question the true meaning of success. A chance meeting with an old childhood friend brought back memories that Henry had long buried. They ran into each other at an expensive restaurant, but unlike Henry, his friend seemed genuinely happy with a simple life. During the conversation, the friend mentioned the upcoming rural fair, praising Richard's work and the incredible recovery of Big Guy. Henry was surprised to hear that Richard was becoming a respected figure among cattle breeders, something he had never imagined was possible. Curiosity began to gnaw at Henry. He had never paid much attention to Richard's work, but the idea that his brother, with so little, was gaining recognition bothered him. He decided he would go to the fair, not to support Richard, but to see for himself what was happening. Meanwhile, Richard was preparing Big Guy for the fair with the same dedication he had shown from the start. He knew this would be the ultimate test of his efforts, the chance to show the world what true dedication could achieve. On the eve of the fair, Richard spent hours by Big Guy's side, cleaning his coat and making sure he was in the best possible condition. There was a mix of anxiety and hope in the air, but Richard was confident. He knew Big Guy was special, but more than that, he knew he had done everything he could to give the ox a chance to shine. The day of the fair arrived, and Richard led Big Guy to the event site. The atmosphere was filled with energy, with cattle breeders, farmers, and curious onlookers from all over circulating through the stalls and exhibition areas. Richard felt a twinge of nervousness at the magnitude of the event, but remained focused on Big Guy. The ox, for his part, seemed calm, as if he knew this was his moment. Henry arrived at the fair a little later, still skeptical about what he might find. He walked through the crowded aisles, observing the animals on display and the deals being made around him. When he finally spotted Richard, something stirred inside him. There was his brother, as simple as ever, but surrounded by people who clearly respected him. Henry watched from a distance as Richard spoke with other breeders, all eager to learn more about Big Guy. Richard noticed Henry's presence but chose to ignore it. At that moment, his attention was entirely on Big Guy and what the ox represented. When it was time to bring Big Guy to the exhibition ring, Richard walked beside him, holding the lead rope with the confidence of someone who knew he had already won, regardless of the outcome. The murmurs of admiration began as soon as Big Guy entered the ring. His recovery was evident, and even the most experienced cattle breeders were impressed by the ox's health and stature. One of the judges, a man with decades of experience in the industry, made a point to praise Richard's work, highlighting how rare it was to see an animal recover so completely from such a debilitated condition. Henry watched in silence, unable to believe what he was seeing. This was the same ox he had dismissed as a joke, and now it was being praised by experts. Something inside him began to change, an unsettling realization that perhaps he had underestimated not only Richard, but also what really mattered in life. The fair continued, and Richard spent the day answering questions and receiving praise from all sides. Henry's presence hovered over him, but Richard didn't let it distract him. He knew he was there for something greater, and the real moment of truth was still to come. As the day at the rural fair wore on, the attention around Big Guy only grew. Cattle breeders from all over were impressed with the ox's recovery, and many began expressing interest in buying the animal. Richard was surprised by the number of offers he received, but remained calm and humble, listening carefully to each proposal. However, the most anticipated moment of the day was yet to come. The auction. Big Guy, now restored to his former glory, would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Word spread quickly through the fair, and the auction for Big Guy soon became the main event, drawing a crowd eager to witness the outcome. Henry, who had been watching everything from a distance, began to feel a mix of emotions he couldn't fully understand. He had always believed that money was the ultimate measure of success. But here was Richard with something Henry could never buy: genuine respect and admiration. Henry realized that despite all his financial success, he had never experienced this kind of recognition. When the auction began, the tension in the air was palpable. Big Guy stood in the center of the ring, his majestic stature drawing looks of admiration from all sides. The auctioneer, a seasoned man known for his ability to handle fierce bidding wars, began to announce Big Guy's qualities, emphasizing his impressive recovery and the genetic value he now represented. The bids started immediately, and to the surprise of many, they quickly escalated. Renowned cattle breeders from across the country competed for the right to take Big Guy home to their herds. Richard watched everything with a mix of pride and humility, knowing that this was the reward for all the effort and dedication he had put into caring for the ox. He had never imagined that Big Guy could be worth so much, but he knew the real value wasn't just in the money he would receive, but in the symbolism of the moment. As the bids rose higher and higher, Henry began to feel something rare: regret. He had underestimated Richard, and worse, he had underestimated what the old ox represented. Henry realized that he was watching something he would never be able to create, a legacy built not with money, but with love and dedication. For the first time, he questioned whether all the wealth he had accumulated was worth it if he didn't have what Richard possessed: a sense of purpose. The auction reached its climax when an exorbitant offer was made, far beyond what anyone had expected. Silence fell over the crowd as the auctioneer repeated the amount, waiting to see if anyone would dare to outbid it, but no one did. With the bang of the gavel, the auctioneer declared Big Guy sold, and the arena erupted in applause. Richard, ever modest, simply nodded in thanks as the buyer approached to congratulate him. Henry stood still, stunned by what he had just witnessed. Big Guy, the ox he had ridiculed as a joke, had just been sold for an amount that rivaled some of his most profitable acquisitions. And Richard, the brother he had always considered inferior, was now being celebrated as a hero in the rural community. After the auction, as the crowd dispersed, Henry finally approached Richard. For a moment, the two stood in silence, just looking at each other. Henry felt the weight of all the unspoken words, the decisions he had made, the path he had chosen. "You did a good job, Richard," Henry said, his voice filled with a sincerity he rarely showed. "Thanks, Henry," Richard replied, without a trace of arrogance or resentment. "But it wasn't just me. Big Guy always had that potential. He just needed someone to believe in him." Henry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He realized that, in a way, Richard was also talking about him, about how he had underestimated what really mattered in life. Henry had always believed he had it all, but standing there with his brother, he realized he was wrong. Richard had something that money couldn't buy, something Henry had lost in his relentless pursuit of wealth. As the two brothers parted ways, there was a silent understanding between them. Henry knew his life would never be the same, and Richard, for his part, felt stronger and more confident than ever. Big Guy, the symbol of everything that had been achieved, was now in good hands, and Richard knew he had done his best to honor their father's memory. After the fair, Henry returned to his mansion, but this time the opulence of the furniture, the grandeur of the hallways, and the silence of the empty rooms felt suffocating. He sat in the living room, surrounded by everything money could buy, and for the first time in years, he felt truly empty. The image of Richard and Big Guy haunted him, like a constant reminder of everything he had neglected in his pursuit of wealth. Henry spent days reflecting on his life, on the choices he had made, and on what he had sacrificed in the name of success. He thought about his father, about the lessons his father had tried to teach him, but that Henry had always ignored. The phrase, "Money can give you many things, Henry, but never true companionship," echoed in his mind, reverberating through the empty hallways of the mansion. Richard's words also weighed heavily on him. Big Guy always had that potential. He just needed someone to believe in him. Henry realized that this was a truth not just about the ox, but also about life in general. He had spent so much time trying to prove his worth through the accumulation of wealth that he hadn't seen that true wealth lay in believing in people, in investing in relationships that truly mattered. One afternoon, as he looked out over the vastness of his estate, Henry made a decision. He knew he had to do something to change his life, to find a meaning that went beyond money. For the first time, he felt the desire to reconnect with something deeper, something he had lost along the way. Henry decided to visit Richard at the farm. He didn't know exactly what he would say or how his brother would react, but he knew he had to try. When he arrived at the farm, he was greeted by the familiar sounds of chickens scratching and the wind blowing through the fields. Richard's farm was simple, but there was a peace there that was absent from any of Henry's luxurious spaces. Richard was in the field, working with some animals, when he saw Henry approaching. He stopped what he was doing and waited as Henry walked toward him. There was a moment of silence, filled with expectations and uncertainties, until Henry finally spoke. "Richard, I've been thinking a lot since the fair, and I realize that, out of everything I've accomplished in life, nothing has brought me the fulfillment that you found here. I want to understand how you did it, How did you find happiness with so little?" Richard looked at his brother, seeing the vulnerability that Henry rarely showed. He knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation, but he also knew it was necessary. "Henry, happiness isn't in the things we own, but in how we value what we have. I've always believed that true wealth is in doing what we love and in taking care of the people and animals that matter to us. Maybe you lost your way, but that doesn't mean you can't find a new one." Richard's words were met with a nod. Henry knew that Richard was right, and he felt a wave of regret for the time he had wasted, but he also felt a new hope, the idea that maybe there was still time to change, to do things differently. In the days that followed, Henry spent more time at Richard's farm. He began to help with the daily tasks, learning about the hard work and care it took to keep the animals healthy. Though it wasn't easy for someone accustomed to a life of luxury, Henry found an unexpected satisfaction in the simplicity of that lifestyle. He also started to reconnect with Richard. The barriers that had formed over the years began to crumble, and the two brothers started to share stories, memories, and even laughs that had long disappeared. Henry realized he was building something valuable, something he could never have bought, a genuine relationship with his brother. Henry's transformation didn't go unnoticed. The farmhands, who were initially skeptical of his presence, began to respect him for his willingness to learn and adapt. Richard, for his part, was happy to see his brother rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of his ambition. Henry knew that this new journey wouldn't be easy, and that he still had much to learn. But for the first time, he was willing to set aside his pride and seek something more than material success. He realized that true wealth was in living a life of meaning and in sharing that life with those who truly mattered. As the months went by, Henry's presence at Richard's farm became a regular part of his routine, a routine that he came to deeply value. The transformation in Henry wasn't just external. The man who once valued luxury and power above all else now found peace in the simplicity of daily work, the company of animals, and the honest conversations with Richard. Mornings began to take on a different meaning for Henry. He woke up early, no longer to review financial reports or prepare for important meetings, but to help Richard feed the animals, clean the barns, and tend to the fields. Every task, no matter how humble, brought with it a sense of purpose that Henry had never experienced in his previous life. The bond between the two brothers also grew stronger with each passing day. Henry started to realize that, contrary to what he had always believed, Richard possessed a wisdom that went far beyond business. Richard had learned, through years of dedication to animals and a simple life, that true happiness lay in things that couldn't be bought: love, respect, and a genuine connection to the world around him. One morning, while they worked side by side, Richard decided to share something that had been on his mind for a while. "Henry," he began, "I've been thinking about what our father would have said if he could see the change you're going through. I think he'd be proud of you, not for what you've achieved, but for what you've become." Henry stopped what he was doing and looked at his brother. Richard's words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He had always sought his father's approval, trying to exceed his expectations with financial success. But now he saw that the true legacy his father wanted to leave was something much deeper. "I never understood what Dad really valued," Henry responded, his voice thick with emotion. "But now I see he was right. Money isn't everything. And I think, finally, I'm starting to understand what really matters." Richard smiled, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. "There's still time, Henry. There's still time for you to build something that truly matters, something you can be proud to leave behind." In that moment, Henry knew what he needed to do. He decided to sell a significant portion of his businesses, something he would never have considered before. The money raised wouldn't be used to accumulate more wealth, but instead to support causes that he now recognized as truly important. Henry began investing in projects that promoted animal welfare, education in underserved communities, and environmental initiatives, causes that he knew Richard supported and that aligned with the values he had rediscovered. The decision was met with surprise in the business world, but Henry was more certain than ever that he was on the right path. He didn't just redistribute his wealth, He also dedicated his time and expertise to ensuring that the resources were used in the best possible way. Over time, Henry began to be recognized for something very different from his fortune: his dedication to social causes and the well-being of the community. People who had once known him only as a wealthy magnate started to respect him for his humanity, for his ability to change, and for his genuine desire to make a difference. Richard, for his part, continued his simple life on the farm, but now with the satisfaction of seeing his brother finally find peace and purpose. He and Henry came to be seen as examples of how life can take unexpected turns and how a person's true worth isn't in what they possess, but in what they choose to do with the gifts they've been given. The legacy of their father, which had seemed lost in the disputes over wealth, was finally honored in the way he had always wanted, not through material goods, but through love, dedication, and the search for a greater purpose. Big Guy, the old lame ox that had started this entire transformation, became a symbol of this new journey, remembered not just as a recovered animal, but as the catalyst for a change that impacted many lives. In the end, Henry and Richard found a new kind of wealth, one that wasn't measured in money but in peace of mind, renewed relationships, and a life lived with purpose. And so the two brothers, once so distant, finally came together, not by circumstance, but by choices that reflected the best of who they could be. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button. Until next time.